Well, here's what Sean Spicer said today about this issue, including some of his response to a question about the Trump campaign lawyers' findings that there was no widespread fraud.
I think there's a lot of states that we didn't compete in where that's not necessarily the case. You look at California and New York, I'm not sure that those statements were, we didn't look at those two states in particular. I think we have to understand where the problem exists, how deep it goes, and then suggest some remedies to it. But right now, to sort of prejudge the process would sort of get in front of the whole need to have it.
What Spicer seems to be saying is that there's no problem with the states Trump won, but states that Clinton won are the ones that might be suspect. Yes? No? Folks, when the President of the United States calls for a major investigation, people usually listen. Hard stop. But what do you do when all the evidence contradicts the need for an investigation? Or is this investigation more of a political exercise to rally Republicans on the issue of voter ID? Joined by Arizona Secretary of State Michele Reagan, who's a Republican, and Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill, who's a Democrat. She also happens to be the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Secretary of State Reagan, let me start with you in Arizona. There is a concern that somehow folks who are not citizens somehow ended up voting. Can you explain how Arizona's procedure works that would prevent something like that from happening?
And absolutely, it's a great question. Arizona's voter registration system is pretty cutting edge in the fact that every time we're registering somebody to vote, we're bouncing it against motor vehicle division to see what their citizenship status is. So we're pretty confident in Arizona that we've got a wonderful system. In fact, I believe there's other states that are trying to copy it right now.
Denise, let me go to you on this. In Connecticut, same question to you. What does your system do in Connecticut that would prevent somebody who's not a citizen from you being able to, how do you catch those folks?
Well, it sounds like we have a similar system to that in Arizona, as do many states. And I should comment that I'm speaking here today as president of a nonpartisan national association. So, you know, my own opinions aside, I would say that our election system in this country is quite secure. And we've been called on, I've been called on personally a lot in the last 6 months to defend it against allegations of hacking and rigging and all kinds of things. And I think it stood up pretty well.
Well, and Secretary of State Merrill, talk larger here for me on all the states. What kind of cooperation? So, for instance, how does Connecticut cooperate with Arizona to double-check double rolls? How does it happen from California to New York? Walk me through that process a little bit.
Well, it is still a state-by-state system. There are some programs available through foundations and others who have tried to help across state lines. And but elections are very local in this country, mostly done at the county level, and they are responsible for checking out to make sure people actually live in that jurisdiction. But there's no way to entirely cross-check the entire national record across the country. So there are lots of people registered in more than one state. Usually that's handled on Election Day or just before Election Day when people re-register. They are asked in most states whether they're registered in another state, and that's how that's handled.
Secretary of State Reagan, let me go to something that I remember candidate Donald Trump brought up. He was a big fan of vote by mail. Your state is one that does a lot of early voting, a lot of vote by mail.
We certainly do.
Walk me through that process. How do you prevent, you know, how is your system secure so that, you know, Joe Smith votes, you know, October 30th,
and
then
you know that's really Joe Smith.
Exactly, and that Joe Smith shows up on Election Day to try to vote. How does your system stop Joe Smith from voting twice?
Well, in Arizona, a lot of people like to vote by mail, and so it's a pretty sophisticated system, and it continues to grow every election. But basically, the voter is signing the outside of the envelope if they choose to vote by mail, and that signature is checked, sometimes several times, to make sure that that really is the voter. And if there's any questions, the county officials will actually call the voter and ask them. So we've got that pretty well covered. And then in addition to that, Arizona's got ID at the polls, voter ID at the polls. And, you know, this isn't bringing in a long-form birth certificate or anything. This is bringing in a photo ID, a couple of pieces of mail, to prove who you are, and that seems to work really well. It's a great safeguard. And the system will also tell you, our e-poll books will tell someone at the polls if someone's already voted. So if they've already sent in a ballot, you know, they're going to be alerted when they're at the polls.
And Secretary of State Merrill, walk me through the process of the transparency aspect after the election. So, because there are a lot of people who've done their own investigating on this. There are a lot of groups that have done investigating. How transparent are the states in putting up the voter rolls to letting people know who voted and who didn't?
Well, it's very transparent in almost every state, and most of the information, both on the voter rolls and in the statement of vote that's after the election, is all published and open to freedom of information rules and everything else. In fact, most of the time people get upset when they realize that their voting information is so public. But you can hear also that every state has an investigatory arm. If there are allegations of fraud or misbehavior or any kind of activity on Election Day or any other time, any citizen in most states can bring a claim of fraud or misbehavior, and that is investigated usually by a bipartisan commission that seeks to take it out of the political arena, and every state gets literally hundreds of complaints on Election Day and before and after about things. They are investigated with great seriousness. So there are lots of processes in place, and I think the states, all of them, take it very seriously.
Secretary of State Reagan, let me ask you specifically, how many complaints, maybe, you know, I get it if you can say, I don't know if it's 403 or 402, but about how many complaints did you get in 2016? And how much investigating did you do, and did any of them prove to be fraud?
Well, we always take any allegation that we hear of fraud seriously, so sometimes whether it's substantiated or not, the goal is to make sure our system is as free from fraud as possible. So that's something we're always going to look into. We hear things during every election that some of them are rumors, some of them may be fact, but there aren't a lot of convictions of voter fraud, and that's actually a good thing. I like to point to that again. That means the system's working, that we have the laws in place to make it as free from fraud as possible.
Can you give me the last time, Secretary of State Merrill, that there was any sort of significant voter fraud that you can come up with?
Well, it's a widespread belief in the election community that voter fraud is extremely rare. It's frequently heard and sometimes alleged, rarely proven. And I think I went back 20 years in Connecticut's records to see, when this all came up about 5 or 6 years ago, to see if there really was, you know, any kind of allegations, unproven or proven. And we came up with one proven case in 20 years, and that was without intent. In other words, it was a student who thought she had the right to vote and she didn't. So that's pretty typical.
Very quickly, Secretary of State Reagan, anything can you think back in Arizona's history?
Yeah, probably the most notable was just a couple of years ago during the 2014 election. We did have an individual vote in 2 states, knowingly vote in 2 states, and so of course that was sent over to the Attorney General's office. But we find this stuff out by comparing rolls with other states that we do collaborate with, and so the system works pretty well. It will catch people eventually. All right, Secretaries of State Michele Reagan and Denise Merrill, thank you both. Apologize for a little bit of my brain freeze there on names, but I wanted to appreciate you both coming on and spending some time with us. I'll see my secretary in D.C. Oh, very good. We'll see you at that meeting. We have a big convention coming up, and I'm sure this will be a topic of discussion. More people will show up, I promise. All right, let me bring in tonight's